Hello everybody and welcome to FM Live. My name is Keith Tanner and I'm here to give you a tour of some of the differences between the ND1 Miata and the ND2. Now, last week we did a little rundown on some of the differences on these things. We focused more on the modification side of things. I'm going to be focusing on how they're different from the factory, how these things differ technically. Please hit me up with questions. We're going to rely on that a lot during this particular video. If there's something you want to know, any specific detail, I'll do my best to answer it. If I can't answer it live here, we'll make sure we come up with the answer and put it in the comments on these videos. We do have quite a bit of information on these cars on our website right now. If you go to the news section, you'll see that we have teardowns of this poor little beast right here. We pulled its manifolds off. We've been inside its transmission housing, that sort of thing, or its bell housing. So we have a lot of information there if you want to know very, very nerdy stuff. I will do my best to address nerdy stuff, but just in case my brain has leaked something. So I'm going to start with a history of the ND Miata. As you know, came out in 2015 as a 2016 model. We had one as soon as we could possibly get it. And the first year, there weren't any changes, obviously, other than some ongoing changes to the transmission. We'll talk about transmissions. But in 2017, Mazda introduced the RF. And a lot of people don't realize this because it wasn't put in press releases and things, but Mazda actually recalibrated the suspension in 2017 for the RF. The original 2016s came with the club suspension with the Bilsteins wasn't really very well calibrated. I said at the time it's not a suspension I would have signed off on, and Mazda apparently agreed because when they came out with the RF, they went to what we call the version 2 Bilstein suspension. They softened up the damping, backed off the damping quite a bit. It became much more supple and became actually a very, very good suspension setup. The steering rack was also recalibrated at that point with much better on-center feel, much better tracking. That was something that bothered us on the original cars. Mazda addressed that in 2017 on the RF. There were also changes like the rear bump stops were changed. There was a subframe brace that was modified a little bit so it wasn't too stiff, which is an interesting little piece of tuning. And in 2018, those RF suspension changes got moved over to the Roadster, over to the soft top. So by 2018, all of the cars had the suspension that most people think was introduced with the ND2. The improved Bilsteins, the improved rear bump stops. That was actually on the cars in 2018, and the steering rack as well. But since Mazda didn't talk about it, nobody knew about it. If you are tuned into these cars, you drive them all the time, you can feel that improved steering rack immediately. It's a dramatic change. I'm going to refer to my notes here. One of the other changes that we saw around that time, around 2018, was the transition to direct tire pressure monitoring systems. That means that on the early car, it was using the ABS sensors and the steering angle sensors and doing a bunch of voodoo and figuring out tire pressure variations from that. Starting in 2018, they went to actual sensors in the wheels, which is very accurate. It can tell you, well, it doesn't actually tell you what the pressure is, but it's measuring it. The problem is it means every time you swap out wheels that you need to have a new sensor or you have to deal with the fact that you have a TPMS light on the dashboard. I'm a big fan of the indirect. I kind of miss it, but that's the way it is. This poor car has had a TPMS light on pretty much permanently since it came to Flyin Miata because it's always on a different set of wheels. There was also one really big change happened in late 2018 on the RF. They changed the window seals. They got rid of that little, they minimized the little waffling noise for those who can't really see it here. But anyway, somewhere in this window seal, they made changes and it actually got rid of a lot of the wind noise on the interstate. It was noticeable immediately when you picked this car up from the dealer and tried to drive it home from Denver. You could tell right away it was quieter. I think that can be retrofitted. We haven't tried, but if you have a 2017 or an early 2018, you might want to look into that window seal. It's kind of nice. Anyway, that's the boring stuff. There's also stuff like the color of the bezel around the screen. On the dashboard, the dashboard screen itself also got higher resolution at some point. It got sharper. But this is Flyin Miata. You're not interested in that. You want to know what's under the hood. That's where the real changes happened with the ND2. It wasn't things like suspension that everyone think it is. It was under hood, and that was primarily the top end of the engine. We have on our site, we have all of the specific changes that were made in terms of port diameters and things like this. The intake manifold was redesigned. The intake ports, they are Siamese. They were Siamese in a much different place. It went from being in the intake manifold to being inside the head, if I remember correctly. Exhaust ports were 3 millimeters larger. Throttle body was the same size, but there's a bunch of changes on the intake side of the engine. The head was modified, and the effect of all this was a bump in redline from 6,600 RPM to 7,500 RPM. And the driving experience is such that if you don't take the car much past 6,000 RPM, you won't notice much of a difference. But if you do like to wrap it out, you do just keep in it after 6,000. It's almost like it gets a second wind. I don't want to say VTEC-like because that's a step change, but it just kind of, it gets more and more eager and pulls towards the red line the faster you go. So it's a really fun engine on track. Driving on traffic, you won't notice, but if you get a chance to really exercise it, this ND2 engine is just a riot. I'll pop the hood so you can see it. Hey Kyle, do we have any questions yet? Okay, I will reiterate, if you do have questions, anybody, I will do my best to answer them. I have some of this information on hand. If I don't have it on hand, I will look it up and we will answer that question for you. Brief product plug. These hydraulic hood lifts are a Flyin Miata part, and honestly, you want them on every one of your cars. Such a difference. Something very similar on a 1966 Cadillac as well. So there you go. There is our ND2 engine. Honestly, it doesn't really look much different than the ND1. Yeah, I mean, stock engine. Woo! The one big change that really has affected, of course, the aftermarket for these cars is that the ECU changed, and no one has gained access to this one yet. I went from a Denso to a, do you recall what kind? To another kind of ECU. And unfortunately, it meant that we lost our access to the ECU, which means I lost our ability to program it, which means that we lost our ability to put in different injectors, to put on turbochargers, to do all the terrible things that we can do to the ND1, which is a real shame. It's impossible to know exactly when we will gain that access again. That's not an ability we have in-house. We're not working on actual programming of the ECU here, so we are counting on third parties for that. And there's been limited success, but nothing good enough to allow us to actually turbocharge or supercharge these engines yet. The turbocharging physically will be easy because that side of the engine is basically the same or close enough that everything will bolt on. Superchargers will have a problem because the intake ports are different, the gaskets are different, so that would require a new intake manifold. So it will take longer for Edelbrock to come up with a supercharger than it will take for BBR to get theirs running. But again, the problem is we just don't have access to the ECU. Other changes that were made, this thing has an oil cooler built into it, although it's not really an oil cooler, it's more of a heat exchanger for the oil. And I think its biggest effect will be to help the engine oil come up the temperature faster. That's great if you're driving in cold weather all the time. If you're hooning around on the track, it's not going to necessarily do you a whole lot of good. A proper oil cooler would be more effective, even if you have to delete that one. And this car, I believe, is actually set up that way right now. So we can do testing to make sure we don't have any warm-up problems in cold temperatures. There's also a difference in the bell housing, is that we have a dual mass flywheel on here, and the flywheel and the clutch are very, very different. Kyle, did we determine, can you retrofit the older clutch? Going to the expert in the corner here.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think you can just take an ND1 clutch and bolt it right onto an ND2. It wouldn't be too difficult to come up with a conversion kit. If you did that, you would need both the clutch and the flywheel. It's very clear that they are a match. And one thing to know about these clutches, they are self-adjusting on both cars. So if you pull a clutch off and you put it back on again, it will have already adjusted once and you will have actually decreased torque handling capabilities. So we have found that on our turbo car over here, we've had the clutch on and off of that thing a few times, and we know that it does not hold as much torque as it did when it was new. So that's a problem. Fun little feature of these self-adjusting clutches, unfortunately. You can sort of unadjust them, but it's a bit of hit or miss. There was something else I was going to talk about. I wonder what it was. The throttle mapping on this thing. One very noticeable difference on this engine is that they've gone from a 2-stage injection to a 3-stage injection under certain modes. that means the direct injection injectors can fire up to 3 times per cylinder event. So instead of the old port injection stuff on old Miatas where you get 1 squirt per spark plug pop, these things can go up to 3. And it doesn't show up on dyno charts, but it makes a very, very noticeable difference on drivability. If you spend a lot of time around engine calibration, like a lot of our guys do here, you can really pick up on it. It's much smoother. It feels like it has more torque down low, although that's a part throttle thing, so it doesn't show up on dyno charts. And I believe this is actually a more efficient engine emissions-wise. It's actually cleaner, and I think a lot of that comes from that triple stage injection. This is a level 3 PLEV, that is a level 2. So, fun fact. I had to look that one up. Any questions, Kyle?
One, can you go over some of the differences between the model offerings? So like there's Club, GT, now what are the new offerings and what kind of...
Okay, yeah, model offerings. Basically when the ND was first introduced, we had the Club, the Sport, and the GT. Oddly, the Sport did not have the sporty suspension. The Club had the Sport, the overdamped Sport suspension, and the GT had so the Club had the overdamped Bilstein Club suspension, and the GT had the Sport suspension. It was just basically a Sport with a lot of stuff on the interior. That stayed up until 2018. In 2019, Mazda introduced the GTS package, which is what we all wanted all along, which is the nice interior of the GT, but with the underpinnings of a Club. And this is a GTS right here. I think the black roof is actually a giveaway on these things on the RF, but basically it's got a limited slip differential. It's got the, well, had the Bilstein suspension, but it also has the leather interior, the full instrument package, you know, the full sensing capabilities, that sort of thing. So it's still a fairly simple option package. You've got the low end, the most affordable Sport. Sport actually costs less today than a 1990 Miata cost in 1990, believe it or not. There's a lot more car for the money, but so there's the Sport, there's the Club, which has optional BBS wheels and Brembo brakes. We think you can do better on aftermarket than that, but anyway, if you really want to have them, you can get them. And then there's the GT, which is also available as the GTS, which is basically take all the good stuff from a Club, take all the good stuff from a GT, mush them together, and you end up with one of these. And oddly enough, they're the most expensive. Kyle.
Can you go into any more detail on the differences between the transmissions through the years?
Transmissions through the years. That is some people live and breathe that stuff. I must admit, I do not know all the detailed changes on what's gone on in the transmissions. We have not torn down the version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4, version 5s. We have had very few transmission failures. We have not had any transmission failures actually on the ND ourselves. Very few of our customers have reported to us they've had transmission failures. We've never had one apart to investigate it. So I can't tell you exactly what changes were made internally. It's quite possible that one of the reasons for the dual mass flywheel was to improve the transmission durability because it takes a little bit of the shock load out. It's possible. Of course, Mazda never made a dual clutch flywheel with the version 1 transmission, so we don't know. To my understanding, all of the ND2s have the version 5s. I don't believe there have been transmission problems yet, but it's not something we can do anything about, so it's not something we've really focused on all that closely. I will admit that car does have a global cup car spec transmission, because our goal with this car is to test everything else, not to test Mazda's transmission. So to make it a stronger mule, to make it more robust, we put in the same transmission that's used in the global cup cars. It's a version 4, I think, transmission to start off with, so it's got the upgraded second, and then global cup adds the 3rd and 4th MCO gears and reinforced case studs. And yeah, I'd hate to think how many laps this thing has done, how many hours it spent on track, and it's been rock solid. But that's because our goal is not to test the transmission because we can't do much about it, so we just upgraded it to what we could. Anything else, Kyle?
That is it.
We have answered all the questions the internet has about the ND1 versus the ND2. There are some very small, subtle detail changes. You know, CD players disappeared at some point. I'm going to guess 2018. There were a lot of changes in 2018 that were just not mentioned by anybody. Even this color showed up in 2018 in some markets. You know, you get a deeper cubby hole when you do that. Recaro seats became an option actually on the Club in 2019. We unfortunately don't have one of those, but the 30th anniversary cars have those. You know, like I said, there were changes to there's some changes to the gauges. At least the GTS has got a fancy gauge. It reads street signs and does all sorts of cool toys. But fundamentally, that's not the stuff that we focus on here. We focus more on what's underneath, what's inside, what makes them run. So there we go. I hope that answers some of the questions we missed out on last week. Let me check my notes. There you go. That's everything I was going to talk about. So I hope that answered some of your questions. Again, if you have any more, put them in the comments in the video. We will answer them in the comments in the video to the best of our capabilities. Have a look on our website. In the news section, there is a link to some fairly deep investigation we did on this poor thing. We haven't had the head off, but we've been just about that's about the next step. And we documented all the changes we found, discussed them. We answered a lot of questions. There's a big Miata forum thread. I think it's 17 pages long, where we're talking about the driving experience on this car, about the technical things that we found, dyno charts that we've done on this car. I can tell you one thing. We found out these are very, very responsive to exhaust changes, which is odd because it's probably because of the higher RPM, but all across the board, we have had higher power gains throughout the range on this car than we have on the earlier ones. The mid-pipe is different on the exhaust is different on these, the muffler, but I think the mid-pipe is the same. Exactly where it's coming from, we're not sure, but we're going to confirm that with backing it up with our 30th anniversary car and confirm that it's not an outlier, that it's actually legitimate. The gains we're seeing are legitimate, but something like 19 horsepower with an exhaust and mid-pipe, it's been quite successful. So that's all I have. This is our last Facebook Live before the Christmas break. So all of you out there in internet land, have a Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, whatever it is you do for a good time over the New Year break. We hope you enjoy it, some time with your family, and we will see you again in the new year. Thank you very much.